Hi, everyone. Our next panel will focus on demographic and socioeconomic shifts within the Republican and Democratic coalitions and how they might shape economic policy in 2025 and beyond. I'm very pleased to be joined by two of the most insightful analysts of the American political scene. Patrick Ruffini is founding partner of Echelon Insights, one of the nation's most well-regarded polling firms, which is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary, and author of Party of the People, Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition, Remaking the GOP. Liam Donovan is a government relations strategist at Bracewell, an alumnus of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and a prolific and keen-eyed commentator whose insights can be found in Politico, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and the wide world of cable news. Being incredibly modern, savvy political thinkers, they also both have terrific Substacks, which I recommend you subscribe to. I'm sorry to say our friend Henry Olson had to handle a family matter, and so he won't be joining us this afternoon. Patrick, a number of influential commentators have argued that as the Republican Party grows more working class, the changing Republican base is demanding an expanded welfare state, higher taxes on the rich, and more support for organized labor. You've argued that this isn't quite right, that the working class shift is driven more by what you've called tough guy populism. Tell us what you mean by that.
Sure. Everything about this realignment that I think it's not something that we've only seen in the last few years since Donald Trump has been on the scene, but really going back to the 1960s. It has really been driven by fissures over cultural issues. So you go back to the 1960s, and it's really, the breaking point over Vietnam and the counterculture that really unmoors a large segment of formerly Democratic voters from the Democratic Party, and they gradually move into the Republican Party. And I think from all of every analysis of that I've seen of longitudinal, long-term public opinion data, shows that it is really those voters who, voting has become much more aligned with social and cultural issues. And there's been no real change in sort of the relationship between economic conservatism or economic liberalism or progressivism and how people vote. So it really is a cultural issue divide. But what I think it can say, I think what we can say is, I think a lot of people tried to characterize this new electorate or the electorate that both candidates are facing this year as either economically right or economically left. And I think it's more apt to say that this is an electorate with no fixed economic ideology, right? They have a very definite social ideology, left or right. But their view of economic issues is just much more pragmatic. It's governed by their view of specific economic conditions, which today their perceptions of the Biden administration's economic performance are quite poor. And that's what's really driving the economic debate in this election, more so than either an intra-right or a right-left debate on what we should do with the economy.
So if you're trying to argue a member of this populist coalition out of their position on the grounds that, well, wait a second, these right-wingers really only care about the rich, that's not going to be a persuasive argument because they don't think in ideological terms?
I think that's, I think to a large extent, that's really motivating. Now, when you look within the Republican coalition, it's interesting because we've done a lot of polling on this that shows that the more you support Donald Trump, actually, the more you voice free market viewpoints, the more you voice anti-government viewpoints. And that's because, kind of the Venn diagram between conservatives in the electorate and Trump supporters in the electorate is almost completely overlapping. The idea that there is any distance between the two is really an elite idea, right? That's commonly found inside the Beltway. That when you actually look at the data on issue after issue after issue, doesn't really have any basis in public opinion and in the real world.
David Leonhardt of the New York Times recently made the case that we're seeing a new form of market-skeptical bipartisanship or transpartisanship on Capitol Hill, which he calls neo-populism. Liam, is neo-populism a real thing? How would you describe the ideological landscape among Republicans in Congress? Do you see really well-defined ideological cleavages or no?
A couple thoughts there. Number one, I think the emergence of populist ideas, the horseshoe that you do see emerging, I think is a function of an identity crisis that's happening within the party, within the elected ranks. And there's some sort of legislative entrepreneurship going on of people trying to figure out, okay, what Trump did worked, what we had been doing the voters don't want, so we need to figure out and maybe backfill what a program looks like. You're seeing different flavors of it in the form of, mostly on the Senate side, you're seeing it with J.D. Vance, with Josh Hawley, with Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton to some degree. They're not all approaching it the same way, but the through line is populist themes. I tend to think that it's interesting. It might have, there might be ideas that come out of that you could build around. But right now, it's still in the early stages where people are feeling out an identity, trying to figure out what works. In terms of thinking about, particularly in the Republican conference, I think ideology is probably the wrong lens, at least if we're trying to understand the last 2 years. It is much more less about your policy positions, more about your attitude toward power, both the leadership structure and the other side, in terms of, do you believe that your voters sent you to Washington to make incremental progress and to make things a little bit more conservative within the constraints of being in a town that's largely led by Democrats? Or do they send you there to burn it all down? And that's the relevant cleavage. If you think about just from that, if we think about what the turning point in the last 2 years was that pretended what we've seen over the last, since the 2022 election, was the vote for, following the vote for speaker within the conference. When Leader McCarthy got the majority of his conference, that's typically the end of the story. Everyone else falls in line. There's an understanding that within the Republican conference, the only way that you have a meaningful majority is that the will of that majority is respected. Once you go to the floor, that is the only power that you have. What 20 to 25 members realized was, no, this is where our leverage starts. Our ability to say, no, we're not going to vote for you, Kevin, unless you do everything we want. That reoriented the power dynamics and, on the one hand, hamstrung what a speaker was able to do with a slim majority and only one of the levers of power within D.C., and it informed everything else that came after that. So I think what the members of the conference believe as an ideological member, or as an ideological matter, matters a lot less than, do we believe we're there to come up with a strategy, go out and execute it, and put points on the board? Or are you more interested in waging some war internally, accruing power? And I think that's all a function of the incentive structures that have fundamentally changed over the last 10, 20 years. Because it used to be you came to town, if you're somebody that aspires to office, you come to, you didn't come to be a backbench member. You either go through the committee structure and you work your way up and, do good things for your district, or you want to someday run statewide, or you come up through the leadership structure. You're Kevin McCarthy, you come in your second term, you work your way up and eventually want to be speaker. More and more, you've always had gadflies, but more and more you have people that have come here with the understanding that it is at once more satisfying, in some ways you can raise your profile more by having your podcast and having your Twitter your Twitter following, and even if your antics get you kicked off committees, you didn't come here to do committee work. So you can come here and be somebody and have the only power that matters, and it has nothing to do with policy.
So it's kind of anti-institutionalist
approach. It's anti-institutional, absolutely. And I think the other piece of this is you have such based on how if you think about how the map gets redrawn every 10 years, there was a scramble to redraw it this time in a way that reflected the changing coalitions that Patrick has talked about. But that means that there are fewer and fewer of the sorts of seats that are losable in a general election. There are a heck of a lot that can be lost if you're looking over your shoulder at your right flank. And so when the primary is tantamount to the general, you're much more, you might want to be with leadership, you might want to be here to get things done, but when the person in a similar district is out there, doing stunts like you saw from the elements of the conference that did that, it pulls your tactics in that direction. And I think the other piece of this is those antics drive the people who want to be there to govern out. And so just as an institutional grandfather's axe element, you're just going to end up with a fundamentally different, we talked about this before, but if we flash forward to next Congress, if every Republican wins out, you would have 85 members who were even around for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and for the first Trump term.
Which wasn't ancient history. That was just
less than a
2017. Yeah. So I wonder, Patrick, you have done a number of cluster analyses of the universe of potential Republican voters. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about the patterns you've observed. What are the factions? What are the different psychographic types that might be part of a Trump coalition in 2024?
Sure. I mean, there are many, but there's one that we did at the outset of the Republican primaries in 2024. Where we had identified 6 factions, and I think that you have clearly the largest one is pretty maximalist on everything, right? They're pretty consistent.
I think you call them the ultra concerned.
Yes, and it was based upon because I think that public opinion on the right particularly seems to be less and less defined by let's just say we've got, all right, where do you stand on issue X, but more, when the war on woke comes up, or something new, some new outrage comes up. What is your level?
What is your level of outrage?
Outrage around that.
So people who are an 11 on every one of these questions,
right, are the largest group. And what we found was, to some degree, right. This was right at the outset of the Trump versus DeSantis, what we thought was going to be the great Trump versus DeSantis battle. In early 2023. And these are the voters that are, like Ron DeSantis is really going squarely head on, to really swipe what were really Donald Trump's strongest supporters under his, and it looked for a brief moment after the 2022 midterms that, this group could be evenly split, could be persuaded. And if you swipe this largest group, it's over for Trump. Well, very quickly, and even before the Bragg indictment, very quickly, it turns out that this group really rallies back behind Trump. I mean, that was like January 6th, like a number, like the midterms, right? This was just a quick moment in time where he appeared vulnerable and then turned out not to be. But among there are 2 groups that I would kind of highlight. Is you have a group of mostly younger people who are maybe more cosmopolitan on I would say on maybe the quote unquote old social issues, but nonetheless are what I would call the anti-woke, right? That they actually do gravitate on this message.
Call them the Barry Weiss voters.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right. Exactly. Right. So there does exist that coalition, and you kind of saw. And
it wasn't a tiny group. I recall it was something like 13% of that.
That's right. Yeah. Right. So it punched right above its weight in a 6-way grouping. Right, but and that was kind of the Vivek Ramaswamy voters. I think the early Vivek Ramaswamy voters, I would say, like that sort of new.
So they're believers in meritocracy. That's a big issue for them. Right. But again, they're not necessarily motivated by gun rights or abortion.
Right, but I think the more interesting group is a 20% group that I call MAGA moderates. Right, sort of this idea of Trump has this incredible strength, right, among the kind of largest core of very conservative primary voters. But we have this image of, the moderate Nikki Haley voter, the moderate voter who is not enamored of Donald Trump, but these are moderate voters who maybe weren't enamored of Donald Trump, but really didn't see any other alternatives, voted for him both times, and had very few fixed positions on a lot of these ideological issues, but were really for Trump kind of in a lukewarm way, but not really considering anyone else. And if you look at the voters who, ultimately decide Republican primaries, Donald Trump won the 2016 nomination with the same voters who broke late for Mitt Romney, with the same voters who broke late for John McCain, the people who are not, firmly committed in one lane of the party, who are not as ideologically committed.
We used to call them the somewhat conservatives, right?
Right. I mean, to some extent, right. So that group of voters, right. So I do think that it's not just a straight right, left-right kind of dynamic.
It's fascinating. A year ago, Jay Kang of The New Yorker drew a contrast between the right's anti-woke culture warriors and its class war populists, who aim to speak for the left behind. He argued that while class war populists deserve to be taken seriously, the anti-woke culture war was fake, a smokescreen for Reagan-Bush conservatives looking to reinvent themselves in the Trump era. Liam, I wonder what you think about this. Many of my colleagues see this differently. They believe that, folks who believe deeply in colorblind meritocracy, that this really is very genuine. In some ways, it's a more salient and pressing issue than class war, and that actually this is a political formula that can unite blue-collar voters and upper middle class voters who've been bleeding away from the right of center coalition. I'm curious if you buy that.
I think it's a false dichotomy. I think to your point, not only can it be blended together, it has been in the past, because what we talk about in terms of anti-woke, the issue suite might be different, but it's no different than the sorts of cultural war, not in the sense of the issues we were talking about before, but like broad culture war issues, the Archery Bunker type culture war issues that we saw with the hard hats in the 60s and 70s into the 80s. It's how the Reagan coalition came together. It's how you got Nixon Democrats. It's how you got Reagan Democrats. So I think the idea that these things can't be brought together is demonstrably false. And I do think, saying that it's a bad faith thing, that is not my sense, certainly. But the idea that one should be taken seriously and the other should be dismissed, I think, is something you do at your own political peril.
Let's turn to the Democrats who face their own cleavages on economic policy. The Biden campaign is running on essentially the same menu of upper-income tax increases they ran on in 2020. Tax increases they often weren't able to pass with the Democratic trifecta. How does Democratic reliance on upscale voters impact the intra-party debate over the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and tax policy more broadly come 2025? Liam, I know you follow this very closely, so curious to see, where you see the divide.
I do. It's very interesting. I mean, for one thing, if you think back, part of what we're leading into in 2025 with the cliff, it's a reprise of what we saw in 2011, 2012, 2013, or I guess it was 13 when it was ultimately punted, but it was a replay of using the reconciliation process that gave us the 01-03 Bush tax cuts, set up a situation where you were basically daring the future Congress to let it go. What happened there was you had an instance where first, after a pretty good shellacking or whatever, I think whatever Obama called it, he said, okay, fine, I don't want any part of raising people's taxes. We'll do a 2-year extension. So it pushed out until after the 2012 election. And the 2012 election, obviously, was quite good for Obama, and he didn't feel compelled to do the same. But even still, despite such a bad night for Republicans in 2012, in early 2013, they were actually able to get 98% of the Bush tax cuts extended. That was before, we were in the middle of this sorting. It wasn't full-fledged at that point. But at that point, you had the threshold whereby Democrats were talking about the rich. It was something like 200,000, let's say. And the interesting thing there was, and I fear we're going to be in a similar position next year, was if anybody remembers the idea of Boehner's Plan B, there was an opportunity for Republicans to essentially pick the price point at which people became rich and therefore should be paying higher taxes. And there was an attitude among Republicans and sort of I think this was a function of Grover pledge sort of discipline. They said, we're not going to vote for anything affirmatively that would raise taxes. That would be a pledge violation, would be bad. So instead, that was like, fine, Democrats picked a number, and that number ended up being 400,000. So that ended up being the top rate. That was where the 39% rate kicked in. And flashing forward, Biden is now using that as the figure where, anything below that is good. That's the middle class. Anything above it, that's the rich people who are bad and should pay more in taxes. And so that's the fight that's shaping up here. But I think to your point, as Democrats are much more reliant on upper income, high socioeconomic status individuals, that becomes much more salient for them. Depend on the balance of power, and particularly as the Senate map looks pretty strong, it looks like at worst it would be divided government. And so I think Republicans will still be in the position where they need to pick some sort of mean there. Of course, if they do get a trifecta, they'd be able to do what they can agree on, which is not going to be easy. One thing I will shout out, though, because Patrick tweeted something on it earlier that's quite fascinating, was a map of where, I think you used $1.5 million home values and what their partisan affiliation was. It was quite red. It was redder than it might, our discourse might tell us. But I thought that was an interesting.
Fascinating. Patrick, talk to us about where the upper middle class is politically, how that's shaping Democratic and Republican priorities.
I mean, I think somebody made the comment that 400,000 is the kind of the threshold for a pair of a couple that's both New York Times reporters, right? I mean that it's conveniently designed right at that level, no, I think at some level that. What's interesting, I'm surprised that this, say, economic realignment hasn't reared its head in the same way that it really hasn't had very much of a transformative effect on Republican economic policy outside of trade, which really Trump foregrounded. But, we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? That was, Donald Trump getting behind a conventional Republican economic policy position. In the same way, I don't think Democrats really have fully surrendered that positioning, right, on tax cuts for the wealthy, right?
And if you look at public opinion among upper-income Democrats, they do seem quite supportive of progressive priorities, at least in theory.
Yeah, and it's both advantageous. They judge it to be advantageous for them politically, right? Because it's a popular, you poll this, it's pretty popular. But in the same way as, in some sense, Republicans have been guided by these cultural concerns, so too have Democrats. That so long as Donald Trump is on the scene, so long as you have the prospect of abortion ban, so long as you have, the prospect of, oh my God, democracy is going to end if Trump wins. I think the tax policy is going to fall pretty far down the priority list, right, for a lot of these voters, for a lot of these upper class voters who have more these cosmopolitan cultural values. And so, yes, you do have some discontent from the SALT caucus, right? That includes both Democrats and Republicans, but a healthy share of Democrats. But at the end of the day, this is still not a huge part of the Democratic coalition.
As an elective issue, Patrick's exactly right. I think the catch is this $4.6 trillion cliff's coming, like it or not. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a great point. The SALT issue in particular, so the SALT cap goes away. Everything goes back to the way it was, which amounts to $4.6 trillion. But it does raise the question of, I think Democrats would be happy to not have any of these fights, not have to pick that threshold where somebody magically becomes rich, or what the amount of SALT you should be able to deduct. That's a hairy problem. It's not something they want to deal with, and they'd much rather be talking about the animating issues that are keeping their coalition together. But I think this is coming, like it or not. Congress tends to kick the can whenever it can. I think the real forcing mechanism you can imagine is the never-ending doom loop of debt ceiling fights is going to come back in the probably second quarter of next year, and that's probably what forces this conversation. But no, it's not an animating factor, but it's one when it comes through, they're going to have to deal with some very tough pain points in terms of remembering who their current coalition is.
There's a slew of center-left public intellectuals, Ezra Klein, Jerusalem Demsis, Matt Iglesias, among others, who've been making the case for a politics of abundance. That is a more market-friendly approach aimed at boosting housing supply, renewable energy, infrastructure investment. There are even some elected officials like Jared Polis, the Democratic governor of Colorado, who seem to be embracing this sensibility. Is your sense that market-friendly, moderate Democrats are poised for a comeback? Or is this another issue where it's ultimately culture that matters most, and you're just going to see a random grab bag of folks on these economic issues?
I think in particular, I mean, what's interesting to me about that issue, because you're right that it has emerged sort of on this neoliberal left, and it's also very interesting to see that catchphrase, right, actually take hold when it was, a kind of a term of derision on the left, right? But what's interesting is that agenda is happening, but it's happening in red states. Maybe blue cities in red states, but if you look at what's happening in Miami, you look at what's happening all throughout Texas, right? They're really the model for this abundance agenda, right? And why is it happening? Because red state governors are more than happy to, use their population growth figures as a club to beat Gavin Newsom, right, in California and their failures. And just as Leah mentioned the $1.5 million housing map, half of those houses are in California, because they can't build housing. Housing supply is so constrained.
IRA subsidies are being used to build solar and wind energy in red America.
Right, exactly.
The battery belt up in Georgia, Brian Kemp.
And that is right. And that's partly because it's the only place you can build things anymore is in red states. The only place you have space to build things is in red states. And you have, tax-friendly policies, a lot of open space, a lower cost of living, where people want to move. And so it's an interesting paradox where I think you're seeing it thrive. Maybe you have a community of folks or Austin sort of being this model, right? And it's sort of this balance, right? Because if it works too well for these red states, those red states might become blue.
Right.
Right.
I'm curious also about the relationship with business. So, when you think about the relationship with big business, the stereotype, certainly stretching back to the 70s and 80s, is that the conservative right is in the pocket of big business, right? Then there was this libertarian critique that, we're against crony capitalism, we're pro-market, not pro-business. But you've seen this social transformation. These education polarization dynamics we're describing the electorate are also playing out in corporate boardrooms. So, now you have a lot of companies that are trying to attract young, talented, skilled employees in these high-cost metros. And so, it seems that there's this changing partisan alignment of who's in the corporate C-suite. I wonder what you see as the implications of that for political economy. Do you believe that Democrats, because of this, are going to become more business friendly? Again, not necessarily more market friendly, but more business friendly. And do you see an alienation between Republicans and the business class that could prove problematic in the future?
I mean, I say this as somebody who represents and advises business, and I think it's a tough position where just because you're crosswise with Republicans doesn't mean that Democrats are coming to your aid, and to some degree some of the fallout specifically with the chamber relates directly to their support for Democrats, because they tried to say, well, let's embrace the folks who've taken some good votes and that kind of thing. There's no real reward for that. There's no real market for that. And part of that goes back to the previous question you asked, which was, I don't know if there's a market on the left for, I don't want to overstate the parallels. I think on the left, there might be more of an appetite for strategic voting to get somebody who can win that general. But in a state where you don't have to worry about winning the general, you go for the most progressive person. And that's not necessarily going to be a business-friendly person. But I do think there are certainly, and I think the IRA is a good example of this, where you got policies, and part of this is just I think Democrats should thank and pitch in for the gold watch for Joe Manchin, because he really saved them in many ways. But his legacy is going to be this law, which is, its best hope at this point is that it works and that businesses put in money and into projects and shovels and steel into the ground. And the faster that happens, the better, because it's going to take that sort of economic activity and the change of the frame for Republicans to think of this law not as a democratic thing, not as an ideological thing, but as jobs, as hard hats, as economic activity. I think looking at the left, there are similar dynamics. It's just it's slightly more functional, and there's a little bit more of a strategic ability to cooperate in ways that I think, I guess I'll come back around to a different version of the answer, which is the best hope that Democrats can give business and corporate community is stability and certainty, in a way that I think the promise of a next Trump administration, there's lots of good in theory that could come, but the uncertainty and the instability is what they fear. And that's the tricky part. Is like people can understand what the next 4 years of a Biden administration would look like. No one knows, and they desperately want to know from us, what does this mean? And the unsatisfying answer is we'll have to see, and we'll have to see who the personnel are, because personnel is policy, and his whims are going to dictate a lot of where things go.
Patrick, you also have a number of clients in the corporate world who are trying to understand the changing sensibilities of voters on the right. So I'm curious where you see the relationship between conservatives and big business going in the future.
Well, I think that this whole idea of woke capital, right, is really the one place where I have seen, in a tangible way, this populist sentiment within the party actually move the needle in terms of really rethinking the commitment, right? The commitment. It used to be, when I first started my career, right, that if you have business comes to Washington, right, there's this presumption that you're pretty much, unless the local Democratic congressman, was sort of, had a lot of jobs in that district, that most of your support was going to come from Republican lawmakers, right, and using kind of free markets. And now, what we're seeing is Republican voters, Republican elites, and Republican activists saying, we're no longer going to give a free pass to corporations, but it's not because of any fundamentally changing ideas about the role of business in the economy. It's because what they see from Disney, what they see from coming out of these boardrooms, right, and the sense that these are not our people anymore, right? These are not, and I think where this sort of more populist positioning has been more successful, and where you see it get much more purchase in terms of grassroots political, in terms of public opinion on the right. Is when people are defined as being completely on the wrong side of our values, and that has been, I think, it was the initial kind of animating principle. It's behind the DeSantis presidential bid, the thought that he might be a viable contender, might be a viable challenger to Donald Trump, came from these fights that he was able to pick in Florida. With organizations people would have thought were traditionally Republican, but were extremely popular. The more he attacked Disney, the more he went up in national polls. I think much more so, and I contrast this with saying, okay, Republicans need to be friendlier to unions. We maybe need to stand on the UAW picket line. You see J.D. Vance doing it. You see some Republicans start to do. That has been far less successful than the things you can attach to the cultural agenda.
So slightly tangential, but I do wonder how you think about the corporate course correction. There have been a number of prominent business leaders who've said essentially, look guys, we want to stay out of electoral politics, or even have gone so far as to say that we need to understand and respect folks who are on the right side of the political aisle. Jamie Dimon is one very notable business leader who at the recent World Economic Forum seemed to make noises in that direction, but he's certainly not alone in that regard. And then of course you have consumer-facing brands that have experienced not just, you're accustomed to backlash from folks on the left, but now backlash from consumers on the right. Is your sense that this represents a real sea change and that this course correction is going to be stable when folks in C-suites recognize that it's not just the HR department pushing me from one direction, I also have other folks pushing at me from the other direction, and I'm going to want to steer clear of political controversy?
I mean, I think to the point that you made earlier, that the fact that you have especially in the sorts of companies that we're talking about, in the public markets, the biggest companies in the world, to compete for talent, you have pressure coming from within your employee base. You have pressure coming from without with investors in ESG. You have the sensibilities of the C-suite just being fundamentally different by virtue of the stuff that Patrick's talked about in terms of these are wealthy, college-educated people who don't share the same, don't understand the new party as it exists now. So that's what they have to contend with. I think the recognition, to your point, that you're not going to ever make anybody happy by anything you say, and the best you're going to do is sort of be as neutral as possible. It's not easy to navigate that, but the decision to play and to get out there on issues, I think, is there is an emerging recognition that more bad can happen than good, and part of that's just general comms and public affairs strategy, but just in terms of corporate identity, I think you have to be really careful because there's just you're caught in betwixt and between, and there's going to be a mobilized group who is looking for the opportunity to use any misstep to their advantage.
Two races I'd like to get your thoughts on. Two interesting Senate races where the kind of right-left contrast, I think, is potentially instructive. So in Pennsylvania, you've got Senator Bob Casey, a fairly straightforward pro-labor Democrat, who's running against Dave McCormick, a successful entrepreneurial and hedge fund manager who's navigating this more populist political landscape. So again, this is a guy who has roots in the state, but he's also associated with hedge funds, high finance, this world that is often demonized, particularly but not exclusively by folks on the political left. Then in Ohio, you have Senator Sherrod Brown, who was firmly on the left of the Democratic Party, now is probably somewhere in the middle of where the party is, facing off against Bernie Moreno, a highly successful car dealer, which is kind of the paradigmatic, Republican donor, way you make money, backed by President Trump. I wonder if you could talk to me a bit about, what you're seeing from McCormick and Moreno, what you're seeing in those races. How do you think they're going to fare? Is it different to be a wealthy self-funder candidate who's coming from the world of high finance versus from owning a chain of car dealerships?
I think it's something that is something you're going to have to navigate. But I think the really clearest, retro positioning, right, I've seen when I talk about retro is sort of like things that were common as recently as the 1990s and 2000s was the 22 Pennsylvania Senate race, where I think John Fetterman quite successfully branded Dr. Oz, his opponent then, who had defeated McCormick in the primary, as out of touch, an interloper, right, a carpetbagger, right, to some extent, he kind of Oz fell into that trap willingly, right, as a political novice. So that's always a risk you have with some of these candidates who are really outside of the political process. But the fact is that remains, I think, I would say, a pretty decent advantage in terms of winning those primaries, right? Being a political outsider, really is the attribute, right? In this age of Trump, that Republican primary voters prize pretty highly.
So the idea of being someone who's self-made in business is actually a plus rather than a minus.
It's a plus, but the question is, how do you thread that needle, right? Because Dr. Oz initially seemed like somebody who maybe had more of a common touch. He was well known in popular culture in the Trump mold, as opposed to, let's say a Mitt Romney high finance type who, famously they tried to get him to embrace this sort of corporate raider, right? His campaign team actually tried to embrace the corporate raider kind of narrative as somebody who could show, that he meant business, and he just wouldn't do it, right? Because that's not who he was fundamentally, in the same way that Donald Trump, was able to tout his wealth. But I think it's certainly quite an interesting dynamic that candidates are going to have to navigate.
Liam, you worked at the NRSC, so you've given a lot of thought to candidate positioning. When you look at those two races, are there any interesting aspects that you'd want to call out for us in thinking about how economic policy debates unfold?
Well, I think you have to think about the commonality that you have with Casey and Brown in particular, and this whole class, including Tester, including Manchin, is the luckiest group of people you've ever collected.
2018 was an incredibly strong year.
But 2006, so they caught a wave in the first place, so they're incumbents now. They flash forward to 2012, which at the time, the NRSC and Republicans thought that was going to be a great cycle. It turned out to be a pretty horrendous one, and it was as bad as people remember the Romney experience being. The Senate was worse. It was an array of on paper great candidates that flopped everywhere. It was a disaster, and it actually set back the project of getting the majority. And if you think about how Senate classes work, that 6-year, you can weave in and out of good midterm cycle, good presidential cycle, good midterm cycle, because of the way these cycles work and the pendulum swings. This is the first time that it syncs back up with the presidential. So what does that mean? Well, in Ohio, that means flash forward, from 2000 2012, the last time he was on the ballot with the presidential candidate, Ohio's a fundamentally different state, in part because the people that Trump brings out were the people that either stayed home or were still okay with Obama back in 2012. So Brown will have the fight of his life no matter what. Just the fundamentals of that state are such that Trump should win it by 8, 10, 12 points. And in an environment where it's just so much harder to fight political gravity and maintain an independent identity such that people are willing to split their tickets. That's fundamentally Sherrod Brown's trouble. The thing about Sherrod Brown is he has this appearance of the rumpled guy. He doesn't look like a cookie cutter politician. It's kind of funny because if you think back to the 2022 race, which was ugly, it ended up being, I think, a bigger win for J.D. Vance than people remember. But the Democrat there actually had, if you look back at Tim's wardrobe in previous years, he was actually a dapper dresser. He's probably looking like Patrick and I did here. But immediately when he's running statewide, he's rolling the sleeves up and he's wearing jeans and stuff like that. So I think Sherrod Brown's image, despite the fact that he's been in elective office since he was 26 years old or something crazy like that, he has the image of the guy that's still cool going down to the local hiring hall and hanging out with the trades. So I think that's what Moreno needs to fight, but he can just hug Trump and come out and win this thing, and I expect that's what will likely happen if he can avoid stepping in it or whatever. Fundamentally different than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is if not the tipping point state. It is the kind of place where Casey still has a golden name in Pennsylvania, despite the fact that there's fewer and fewer voters every year that ever voted for his father. But I think just as a neutral proposition, he fits what Pennsylvania Democrats are kind of okay with. So it's much trickier.
He's also repositioned on abortion, which is going to be absolutely key
and just
issue.
from a residual standpoint, people remember his dad was pro-life. He kind of gets credit on both sides. It's a weird dynamic where he has evolved in his time in the Senate, but I don't think anybody holds it against him, and there's just fewer single-issue voters on that are going to desert him. But if you think about McCormick, to Patrick's point, I think what we saw in 22 was just the playbook that's worked. It's worked in a number of other places. It's how Tester survived, just using that carpetbagger, appealing to the sensibility of this guy's not from here. He's a hedge funder from the Gold Coast. That's tricky, but McCormick has the ability to say, look, I am indeed from here. I was a wrestler, went to West Point, fought for our country, and that's my story of my success. And I want to come home and do right by my home state. But I think the tricky part is in both those states the China issue is a big one. On all sides, you're going to see different people using it, but that's what I've seen them focus on with McCormick is trying to tie hedge fund guy with investments in China and China military. That's such a tough one. If they can make that stick, that's just really brutal. But I think the fundamental problem for McCormick
it's also a throwback back to 2012.
It is. The fundamental problem there is just the political gravity working in those states. Even if Trump wins in Pennsylvania, I don't think we expect him to have a crushing victory. And so that ability of Casey to run a little bit ahead of Biden and maybe corral those third-party voters, because we haven't talked about that because we're not really mostly talking about elections, but the reason that the Senate races look different than the presidential races are in part because the threshold for victory where it matters for Donald Trump is probably 48, 49. You can imagine it being there. For the Senate candidates, they probably need to do a little bit better because the leakage to RFK or whomever is not going to be there in those Senate races. Those people are going to be choosing between the right or the left, and I think that redounds to the benefit of the incumbents.
Fascinating. I wonder, Patrick, you've written a great deal about the evolution of the Hispanic electorate in particular, and I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about what it is we can confidently say about the economic sensibilities of that group. One mental model is that when you're looking at those cross-pressured swing voters among Hispanics, basically they're largely blue-collar, working class, and maybe they do fit that paradigm of really strongly opposing entitlement reform and what have you. Another paradigm is that they're aspirational voters who really, embrace the idea of economic growth, up by your bootstraps kind of mentality, that, the strong guy populism resonates with them because they want to build wealth themselves and get ahead. What do you see there?
I think it's more, it is more of that, and it is just fundamentally a faith that
more of that aspirational
right aspect, because as a population that has come here with nothing, And when you look at the safety nets, right, that exist in most of these countries, they're either non-existent or the governments in these countries steal from the population, right? I mean, there's no sense that the government is a benevolent force. In Hispanic culture, right? It's not like where you would have all the Norwegian immigrants to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is still rural Wisconsin. Parts of rural Wisconsin are still pretty democratic, and Minnesota are still pretty democratic because you had a core of immigrants who believed in social democracy. I mean, you don't really have that with Hispanics. Now, what you've had over several decades is, to some extent, a working class sensibility, an outsider sensibility, a sense of group identity, and people really gravitating in urban political settings towards the Democratic Party for reasons that are not ideological. But I think what we're seeing across the electorate, particularly among non-white voters, and why I think we are seeing a realignment over multiple cycles, not just this cycle and not just the previous cycle, among non-white voters, because you see ideology just starting to matter a whole lot more for these voters. If you say you're ideologically conservative, whatever that means to you, if that means policy positions, if that means social issue positions, you're seeing voters who self-identify as conservatives voting more and more Republican. Now that's a big deal because among white voters, 90+% of white voters who self-identify as conservative vote Republican. Among African American voters, it's about 45%. Right? Among Hispanic voters, it's about 65%. So the idea is if you can get that conservative number up closer to 90%, those are going to be some big shifts, and that's going to fundamentally affect the popular vote, could shift the popular vote by 3 or 4 points. But as far as the economic sensibility, right, you don't, when it comes to Hispanic voters, I mean, you just have so much. As a result of this distrust of government and corruption that you see not only in these Latin American countries but in the United States, you just have family, right, stepping in with the $200 billion in residuals sent back from the United States to Latin America, and that's really kind of the belief that if I'm going to get ahead, I'm going to do it with my own hard work, and then I'm going to be, once I make it, I'm going to pay it back to my family members. And that's just a fundamentally, I think, different belief set, right? Than that which underpins kind of progressive economic ideology.
I'm sure this is an oversimplification, but what I'm hearing from you is that in a funny way, the infusion of a certain constituency of very socially liberal, upscale voters to the Democratic Party is making that party more economically left. And the infusion of a really critically important group of downscale voters might actually get the Republican Party to reaffirm its commitment to a politics of economic opportunity. Does that sound crazy to you?
I don't think so. But I think one of the things you hear along the Rio Grande Valley, which I went, doing research for my book, went down there. And one of the things you hear is, people are really upset actually by this idea of, and are really sensitive to this idea of people getting paid not to work, getting paid by the government not to work. Now, what I would say is like Social Security, Medicare, entitlement programs are seen completely differently. They're not seen as welfare programs. They're seen as programs I paid into, and really, frankly, the only source of retirement savings that a lot of these people have. But when it comes to food stamps, when it comes to a lot of these programs, they do see a lot of fraud in these programs, particularly in these poor areas of South Texas that really are a cash economy. And so it's easy to hide income. And so if it's easy to hide income, it's easy to claim benefits that you don't think. So that's something that people down there are very sensitive to, and in our polling, it's something that they associate, rightly or wrongly, with the Democratic Party.
Liam, there's a pretty good chance that Donald Trump will be back in the White House in 2025, and there's a great deal of reporting about how he's seeking allies in Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and the corporate world, worlds that we're certainly very hostile to or skeptical towards him, as you noted earlier on. Assuming there is a second Trump term, what's your gut on how he'll approach economic policy? One thing we know is that he seems to care about the health of equity markets, right? But how do you see that playing out?
It's a fascinating question because who has his ear at any given point is typically where things come out. And I got to ask that question of like, who does he listen to on economic matters? And it's a revolving door. I mean, one minute he can be listening to, Steve Moore and Larry Kudlow, and the other he can be listening to a donor that's next to him at Mar-a-Lago, or the next moment he can be thinking about Peter Navarro and Bob Lighthizer, because I think there's a mix of people who he listens to because they are successful. He listens to because they're on TV and he likes what they have to say. He listens to them because their policies are kind of aligned with his impulses on trade in particular. And it's that dissonance that makes it really tough to predict how the policies are going to come out. And I think what we saw in 2017 and what we see now as sort of, I think, part of what Donald Trump understands to be missed opportunity is outsourcing the HR functions of his government to Mike Pence, to the Heritage Foundation, to other people. He didn't expect to win, and once he did win, he didn't appreciate how important that was in terms of getting what he wanted done. He was surrounded by a bunch of people he didn't pick, didn't trust, weren't necessarily aligned with what he wanted to do, and surrounded with a bunch of lawyers that were looking for reasons to tell him no and not ways to get to yes. So I think fundamentally, that's the question. What does the plum book look like? What does the personnel look like? What do the beachhead teams look like? Who's coming into these agencies? Who's going to be leading the Treasury Department and whatnot? I think the cast of characters that we saw in the first administration aren't necessarily the sorts of people I would expect to be in this one, but I think that's the guessing game that'll see who shows up over the Trump transition, trying to be in on the ground floor and make a play for it. Because like I said, it's not always coherent. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but whatever he heard last that suited his fancy is what tends to stick in his head and might end up as policy in the next truth or tweet if he comes back to the X platform.
Patrick, curveball question for you. There's a very good chance that President Biden will be reelected. And I wonder what you think about what a second Biden term could look like, given that his approval rating is quite low. And it's quite possible that he could win re-election with a low approval rating, with a profound lack of enthusiasm about his management of the economy. What does that environment look like for economic conservatives? Is that a world where you could see them running the table when it comes to midterms and gubernatorial elections around the country? Is that a kind of period when you could see some interesting building of this coalition you've described in your book? Or do you think there's going to be demoralization on the right in the event that Biden is reelected?
I mean, I think it'll be quick demoralization, right? Because I think, to some extent, there's just fundamentally different, right, psychology, right? I think among people on the right and the left in terms of how they approach the prospect of losing. I mean, Democrats are deathly afraid of losing, and Republicans have they absolutely don't believe they're going to lose. And in some weird way, this was true in 2020, where you do have this bedwetting phenomenon on the left that you just don't have on the right. And they're absolutely maybe overconfident they're going to win. In some instances, this manifests in post-2020 as in a moment of we didn't actually lose among some people, right? That thought. So I just wonder to what extent, right, you will have. Will we see the return of that? Obviously, we saw that play out in some very ugly ways.
Fascinating. So you could imagine another scenario where, Biden wins re-election, and there are a lot of folks who are convinced that it was not on the up and up.
Right. I mean, I think if history is any guide, but the question, I think at that moment, the biggest question is Donald Trump going to try to do it again? Right? Are we just going to see a rerun of this
2028? Yeah.
Right, 2028. I think everything kind of fundamentally revolves around that. I think, certainly midterms would be, if historical patterns prove correct, right? Midterms could once again be seen as an opportunity for Republicans, but we thought the same thing about 2022.
To Patrick's point, I think it does take accepting the loss to be able to bounce back as quickly as Republicans did, both in 2009. Because remember, on inauguration night, that's the famous scene with McConnell and the assorted leadership figures saying we're going to basically make Obama one-term president and go out and win races, and that's what they did. We turned things around.
In the wake of what was a big loss by modern standards.
Huge loss. And remember, Tea Party wave started in the summer of 2009. The Brown election was in January of 2010. I mean, things came back very quickly. The pendulum swung, because there was no time to worry about, whether you lost. You had to unite against the new villain. The same thing happened even after a pretty demoralizing loss in 2012. You came back in 2014 and had a crushing win. You had a huge midterm, probably one of the biggest we can remember. And the catch here is twofold. Number one, as I mentioned before, having, the map that was drawn in 2011 redistricting was not built for the Trump coalition. It was built for a Romney theoretical coalition that never came together, and that's what started being, that wild swing from 2016 to 2018 was reflective of that. So what you saw in the most recent redistricting was redrawing lines in a way to protect incumbents on both sides and get away from these wild swings. So you have both a sturdy House map and that Senate map that I mentioned. This is the class where Republicans have to win. Otherwise, these alignments have already happened. In the other classes, the only other member who is sort of out of step with the presidential lean of their state is Susan Collins, who just manages to defy gravity every time. She's up in 2026. You can see her do it again, but there's obviously with the ranked choice voting, it's a little bit hairy there. But that's defense, not offense. The opportunities are here and now. And so the idea that we're going to bounce back and have a really good midterm, I think they would just in terms of the environment. But there's just
but it wouldn't necessarily translate.
There's only so much. Like they'd win the House popular vote, they can even win the Senate popular vote, but there's just only so much you can get. What we saw and why people were so shocked coming out of 2022. Number one, as Patrick said, Republicans think they're going to win all the time, and so when they don't, they have existential crisis. And Democrats they think they are had this incredible night. They didn't actually have a very good night, but it was better than the alternative. So, but I think if you think about Republicans winning the House popular vote by a pretty substantial margin and only ending up with a 5-vote margin, 10-seat margin.
It's all in New York.
This exactly, and this new map is fairly durable relative to recent years, and I think it's a good.
Sorry,
reflection.
fairly durable in the sense that
it seems to match up pretty well with the coalitions such as they are in this moment. So while you could have a backlash against the 6-year itch of Joe Biden, who's very unpopular at that point, Republicans A, have to get their act together, and B, the seats have to be there. Maybe it's coming. Maybe it'll be in New York, but that means they would have to lose to have those seats to gain back. Part of the reason Republicans stand to have a good night and keep the House, despite everybody counting them out, they shouldn't, because these things happen on the same night in the same places. But the reason people have priced in that Republicans will lose the House beyond the dysfunction that they see on every day is the fact that Biden will win, and therefore there will be a bunch of seats to go. But the fact is, Republicans did so poorly, they're not overexposed in the way that Democrats were in 2020. Because the reason they had the big swings was it was that counter-cyclical, going against Trump, and then Republicans got some of it back, but they're not in a position where they're in seats they had no business belonging. Like a wave usually is reflected by people that are in seats that they can't sustain.
We have time for 2 really quick questions. I wonder if anyone has a question they'd like to ask.
Conrad LaJoy in the Scannon Center. I really appreciate your insight today in this panel. In kind of a piggybacking on the same question, how do you see the neopopulism/neoliberalism move with a Biden victory versus a Trump victory? Does this neopopulism start to fade in the Republican Party with the Trump loss?
Please.
Well, I don't know if this is going to be a satisfying answer to your question, but I think what it raises is the fascinating fact that we have, for the first time in 130 years, 2 men who are term limited. They will be lame ducks as soon as they're elected. So the question becomes, what's next for both sides to figure out. That's why the Veep stakes looms large here, because if you look at the short list, there's a bunch of people that would immediately set off speculation that this is going to be the guy. And I think that's the question is, well, the leaders in the clubhouse will be the respective vice presidents, whoever that person might be. And, I don't know that they'll get it sort of lying down, but I think that's going to be the question is, because that decision has a huge bearing on where the Republican coalition goes in 2028.
Fascinating. So if you have someone who is in that kind of Hawley, Vance, Rubio camp, who's the running mate.
2 of those 3 are apparently on the
right, fascinating. Whereas if it's someone like a Burgum, someone else who's a more traditional conservative.
Or Tim Scott.
Well, I think to a degree, right? You have somebody, J.D. Vance, right, who could be seen as an ideological acolyte of this new right. But at the same time, which will go with that, or will he go with either somebody who he perceives as out of quote unquote out of central casting, right, which seems that he seems to prize highly, or somebody who just won't get in the way, right? Won't necessarily have their own distinctive political identity, like a Doug Burgum or somebody who, may be well positioned to run, but would be.
But it's not going to become a new center of gravity for the party.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because he wants to. I mean, I think he will want to continue to be the.
And who knows, even for a decade plus.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We have someone on the side of the room.
Does regional identity have any relevance in today's politics?
Surprisingly, yes. Surprisingly, I think as somebody who analyzes, voting patterns in different states, it's actually pretty stubborn. In some respects, it has definitely gone away. It has gone down, and I think, why you still have significant parts of rural Wisconsin, right, that are close. It should be a red state. I mean, you just look at straight demographics, right? Wisconsin should be a pretty solidly red state, but because of patterns of settlement going back 100 years, it is not solidly a red state. Obviously, maybe more of a red state now than it was. But I do think that it's something to watch for, right? I mean, particularly like you have. Arizona, Nevada, right, which are two of the, and I don't think either of those are by any means locked in for Donald Trump. But what's interesting is you have very similar demographics in both states, very similarly concentrated populations in one major metro, and one state's trending right while the other state trends left. I do think that is a factor that gets underplayed a lot.
There's so much more to talk about, but please join me in thanking Patrick and Liam for joining us.
Thank you.